I am your host, Loren Gray. Thank you so much for joining us this wonderful day. If you're watching us on your Roku TV or your Amazon TV or your Apple TV or your Google TV or your Samsung TV, thank you for seeing my face on a very large screen. If you're by chance following us on our simulcast on Facebook, multiple pages there, LinkedIn, only one, which is my profile on LinkedIn, Loren Gray on LinkedIn. YouTube, multiple pages there. X, not Twitter anymore. And also Twitch. If you use your gaming console for media, we're on also simulcasting on Twitch. You can look for us under Hospitality Channel. Any which way you find us, in all 209 countries that we broadcast on our TV station, or 39 countries that we simulcast on with all of our social media platforms. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's topic, first off, thank you for the massive feedback from last week's show talking about custom audiences and the new ways and modalities of doing it, breaking it down from the processes of defining the targets as to what we're wanting to identify, people, demographics, behaviorals, and so forth, personas and customer profiles, and the new ways that we can generate custom audiences through action audiences, meaning what we want to measure defining the audience is doing, and then going into how we can amplify those engagements to an audience that Google, in this case, in our pound gorilla in the room, to use to better suit the messaging and the content, and progressively changing our content in a series of first contact versus second contact versus third contact. Not to rehash the whole last week's show, just know there was overwhelming feedback, thankfulness, appreciation, clarities, questions, and to the point that I'm actually going to solicit some of my cohorts in crime, experts in the field, to join me on the live show coming up in the next week or so. We're trying to organize which would be the best date to be able to do this, to really break down more of the details about what we talked about so openly about the two methodologies of developing custom audiences and their usability in your market strategy plan. That was a springboard to our topic today, which really kept resonating with questions as to, how do I know if I have the information I need? How do I know if my campaigns need changes? How do I define my campaigns? Because I'm getting what I'm getting. So I look at it and it seems good. It's the ROI or whatever base metric we're looking at seems to measure correctly. Do I have to worry about things? And the answer unequivocally is yes, for lots of reasons. One is there's never a finished product to what we do in advertising and marketing and communicating. It's always a progression and constant evaluation of what we're doing and making sure that there's not something we can do better than what we're doing or differently than what we're doing that might produce better or find audiences that we haven't targeted. Because when we market to what we think we are feeling is our strongest suit, we're kind of self-fulfilling our program. Literally, the production we get from our efforts warrants the validation of our efforts to begin with and turns into a cycle. And it's always good to get out of that cycle, to look at alternatives and maybe realize that while we're satisfied with the trickle from the creek, the river's just over the hill there, and we probably want to go for that rather than what little we're getting from here. To that end, this week's show topic kind of goes to something we've had in our Hospitality Marketing Club discussions. Kind of a military analogy of, breaking it. It's strange, actually. The thought processes was kind of a weird. We were making Forrest Gump joke comments from the movie, and one of the comments about how he was there listening to Bubba go over and tell him all the different shrimp stuff, and he's breaking down and reassembling his weapon better than everybody else. As if you've seen the movie, where he's like, the sergeant was quite impressed with his speed and efficiency. And we started laughing about how we often, as third-party services vendors and consulting and so forth, are often asked to really critique. We do a lot of auditing. We're constantly asking for being asked for audits to evaluate performance metrics, internal and external, competitive sets, and so forth. And so it's a bit of a deconstruct. We're taking, metaphorically from Forrest Gump's movie, a weapon and breaking it down into its smaller pieces and then reassembling it cleaned and better. So long explanation to where we start joking around this, and that we came up with the idea of, could we field break down a weapon? How fast can we do that? And we're talking about, I can do that in 10 minutes. I can do it in 15 minutes. But we're going to try it in 15, 20 minutes. And that is how to deconstruct and reassemble a failing marketing plan. It's a fun exercise one you should always do, because you should always self-evaluate your campaigns, even if you consider them to be successful, as to, is it as successful as it could be, or is there better ways to improve what we're doing, or doing something different if this is running well enough that we don't have to change it. So we're going to go through a very quick step-by-step process, a workflow, kind of a roadmap of how do you tackle this. You walk in and you're looking at your accounts. Maybe they're for the familiar same olds. You're familiar with what they were set up for. You know the reasons they were set up for, the content, the history of why the content was developed, the history of why the ads were identified the way they were, the variations of the ads. You may remember, if you did it correctly, how the ads won against all the other ads. You may remember all the history. But the one thing, even by doing that process, that you forget is that time passes, changes happen, and our guests, however similar in the sense of their interest in us, isn't similar on how they find our product or remember our product or engage our product. Our product changes every time we have a team member change. Our product changes every time as the season and the dates go on, because our value proposition to our market, our brick and mortar hotels and restaurants, change depending upon the seasonality, ebb and flow of demand to our market. And every year is different. If it wasn't different, we wouldn't have to approach it differently each year. It is every year different. And if you doubt that kind of statement, look to the past 4 years and tell me, any of those 2 years, can you match them up as being the same? Can't. Go back 5 years, same issue. Go back 6, 7 years. You might say, well, there's a couple of years that are pretty close to each other. And yes, in some similarities of business cycle and demand to your market, there may have been some similarities, but each year is different. If you're off $1 different in each year was different. Every day's occupancy is different. Every day's plate count is different. So for that very reason, you have to consistently evaluate your performance metrics, your campaigns, your purpose of your campaigns, the content of your campaigns. So where do you start? Where do you put a stick in the sand? How do you start this process of deconstructing and reassembling your market plans, failing or not? The first step is through an identification process. You really have to look at, take and disassemble down to your pieces. What are you using as KPIs? Is it a good first start of identifying the process? Looking at your ads, what are we measuring? Are we measuring conversion ratios? Are we measuring volume, gross volumes versus granular volumes? Gross volumes being total volume to your site. I see so many weird agencies that do silly things like count how many people went from our website to our book engine. That's my point of truth. And I think I've rapped on that last week, actually, because it's not an unuseful number. It's just not the number. It is a helpful number. As I used in my analogy last week, when I kind of poo-pooed on that, was if you have 4 doors into your restaurant and you're only measuring the traffic through 1 door as your entire measure of your business, you're missing out on 3 other doors of business. So you can't just say that is a definition point, but it's a good number. It's a number that's useful because you can determine if there's an issue with your site as a contributing factor from it to your booking engine. Is there UI issues? Is there content issues? Is there discoverability issues? Is there organic issues? So identification of your KPIs is an initially strong first step. How are we measuring what we say is a point of truth success or not success? Okay. Usually ROI gets thrown into this conversation right off the bat. And as I've poo-pooed on it several times, I've been a pattern of poo-pooing on things. ROI is not the end all be all. It is a measurement, but should not be your only measurement. If everything is measured through ROI, which unfortunately so many places do, so many things can't hold up to that mustard, because ROI isn't always the value proposition that a channel represents. And case in point, historically been a case in point, has been social. Organic social, to be more specific, has been a failure for direct channel contribution, ROI. The time cost factor to that, or content cost to create, where it's not just the writer and the creator, but it's also having the content that they get to write about, is a massive amount of investment that has other values far beyond the direct value that is measured through just a pure ROI lens. And so that KPI always gets into question every year, every budget, which, by the way, we are into the first phases of our wonderful budgetary season for hospitality. Every time it gets put onto the chopping block of necessity, value proposition, able to trim the fat, so to speak, more. Is there any way we can spend less and still get what we basically need from it? These constant questions for organic social live forever No matter how many years we've shown that there's other value propositions to it, if it's only through the lens of ROI, it always gets put on the block of consideration and asked if there's some ways to trim it down. With that being said, once you've identified how you're measuring things, the next thing is, how do they need to be modified? Are you measuring proper KPIs? Just like I brought up the question of ROI, or maybe you have always been using ROI and you're looking at it going, oh, wait a minute, let's look at other ways to measure success. And when I say gross versus granular, if you're looking at total traffic to your website, let's say, and you're looking at the total audience that your website is generating for you, culling out those people that don't stay long enough under the things of bounce rates and so forth, which again are very soft numbers. They used to mean more when there was less numbers to use. Now they mean less because there's more numbers to have. But there is still value to them in the sense of some measurability of how well is your content being absorbed by people that discover it. In and out, because the reason why I put a little caveat on bounce rates is because they're not it's such a cut and dry definition. There are ways that bounce rates can be skewed incorrectly by how they're measured. And I'm not going to get into a tech discussion about that, but there are variations to that. That they're not as, oh, it's only 7 seconds in and not, or if it's only this or not. There's lots of things that can create issues and create artificial bounce rates that give you a different number than a point of truth number that you would like to use. But all of those things, when it comes to how you want to modify your KPIs, is how do we look at them from a gross level? Like, are we looking at the total contribution of this? And that means annually, and that means annual ADRs and annual occupancies and annual length of stays are being used. Are we looking at a monthly level? This is January versus this is February, and these are occupancies and ADRs and length of stays for each of those, and what was the total traffic of the website for it? And that goes, you can just mimic this conversation to your channels, Facebook, LinkedIn, if that's what you use, Google, Bing. These things are all the same criteria of how do you approach identifying the KPIs that you're using, and do they need to be modified as to how you see them being used? The other, like I said, the detail is down to the granular or the broad. Are you looking at annualization of these things where the numbers are a lot softer and more generalized, or are you going down into a monthly level? Maybe even to a weekly level, maybe into a seasonality, maybe even to a day cycle of weekends versus weekdays. Whatever the granular versus broad spectrum is that you're using, be consistent with your comparative analysis. I tend to like going from a more granular level initially by month, because it is a lot of data and can be very intimidating when you're looking at trying to solve an annual review of this. You don't want to get down to a weekly or daily function because you just start getting slogged in the mud. Going down to monthly is about as low as I go to start with. If once we isolate certain issues that certain months seem to stand out from, then it might be worth to go into the daily regime of weekends versus weekdays, or length of stay issues or arrival issues, things like that. So that's the first point: identification of your KPIs, question of being them modified, questionnaire as to how you approach them with granular versus broad. The next step of the process of deconstructing is the measurement updates. We've gone through a massive change in our industry, as everyone else has, when it comes to Google and metrics associated. We are in the GA4 world. And if you haven't heard me rant enough about this, I'm ranting again. As of July 1st, unless you were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in Google 360, your world changed when Universal Analytics stopped running. And if you relied on the generic kickover to GA4, you're not measuring the same things you were measuring prior to the UA. No matter how much you set up in UA, it didn't all come over to your benefit. And it's not measurable numbers over year function that it can do anymore. The numbers are metric different. Plus, you have 3 categories of how you're defining which numbers you want to use, whether you do want to use session-based, user-based, or data-based. And the fact that user-based is going to have an even harder impact on them if that's what you choose, because iOS 17 is going to go over and shrink down their ability to let you linger on them for 7 days instead of the 28 that they're running now. So you're going to get less of a window for historical with them. So what that means is, for somebody that came in as a user, if they come in on the 8th day, they're going to be considered a new user, and you want to count them twice. So you need to understand how to buffer that difference. Anyways, measurement updates is a big component of this. Are you still measuring relevant numbers? And the numbers are you measuring, are they accurate? Can they be counted on as points of truth? Are there too many other reports that you say, I take this piece from this one and this one from this one and that from there, and then I put them into my own custom one. And of course, I have all the labor time to do that. And then I do my own comparisons. If you have that kind of fragmentation to your measurements, got to change it. Got to change it to a unified measurement capability. Automate RPAs. We've had those conversations, robotic programming assistants, that allow you to automate some of these things, do them for you, so to speak. A lot of platforms have integration capabilities. There's a huge new opening world of using a kind of a halfway house of Google Sheets that you can API connect to data to. There, we've talked about tools in our podcast that open up the door for massive amounts of API data influx, and use that data through a macro, an RPA, that will allow you to go over and create that kind of reporting for you. There's a whole different world that has existed that if you built new stuff last year, it's not new stuff this year. And then you start throwing into the whole buzzy word API AI stuff, and you got a whole nother kettle of fish. So measurement updates is your second step. First step, identification. Second is measurement. Measurement of that is looking at the new definitions that you can use with the new data, GA4 being the big poster child on that, and also whether you need to update your data, your reports and dashboards. It has been probably one of the most persistent conversations I have with any client, new or old, when I ask about the validating of why this report exists, who uses it. You'll get first everybody, oh, I always get it, I use it. Okay, here's the report. Show me what you see in this report that you find valuable that you use. A lot of times, nothing. Sometimes it's a number or a ratio. I like think of tab 4 on star reports, if you know what I mean. But most of the time and labor to produce the report, gather the report, and all of it is now just entrenched as to, well, it was here when I got here, and it must be important to somebody because nobody's ever said to not do it. And I have to spend the time to put the data in for the report to be gen for us to have. And most people just put it on the shelf, proverbially, when they get it. That reevaluation, that persistent evaluation of the value of the need of a report should always be ongoing. Reports are one of the first things properties complain about when they talk about corporate and ownership. Is if I have to make one more report to have one more meeting of our report, I'm going to die. Because we forget that we may think we're only asking for one small thing as a department or as a segment or as an individual. But add that to all the other people doing the same thing, and what you have is mountains of reports and a whole lot less time actually doing the work that the reports are supposedly telling people about. A constant evaluation of the true legitimacy of reports' value and use should be an ongoing audit within any organization. Property level, corporate level, ownership, no matter what, it is a persistent request that you always look at whether or not a report is used. If so, how, by whom, and is it still worth being done for the effort that has to be created? Now, granted, some answers that I just told you before, all that about automations, RPAs, and aggregating data and automating the processes and creating dashboards that are dynamic and put the data together for you, alleviate a lot of that kind of, well, it's not really a labor issue, and it's good to have that number there if we ever need to put it on at our fingertips. That validation is validation enough, but that should be something at least it's looked at to make that choice. So then deeper into the measurement options, new strategies that require new workflows and metrics. This goes to, as you look at new data and understand and put it into new dashboards and see them differently, in comparison to how you've been doing it, you may see that there are new strategies that require new modalities, kind of going back to our last week's conversation about custom audiences, that you have a first engagement ad campaign, then you have a second engagement, which is different than your first engagement, okay, a little bit more specific to their interests or their demands or whatever brought them and that you've been able to identify them with, and then a third level, and then there's retargeting capabilities, follow-ups, and then lifetime engagements. That whole process, okay, is a different workflow than what you may have now. Your workflow now may have been very rudimentary. Last year was your first foray into structured ad content that you were hand on the tiller with. And now you've matured enough to know that you now need to make generational engagement content pieces with different workflows. Before, you were just doing a blast and brand awareness program. Here I am, what I am, here I am, what I am, rates and dates, rates and dates. And then you ebb it and flow it depending upon business demand. That would be your measurement of how much budget you put towards it as to how much you would get out of it as an ROI. And then which channels you knew worked well because you had certain events you could promote with your CRM or talk about in organic social. It sounds great. It works great, but it's at a very base level of marketing. It's a starting point. Maybe this is the year you need to create a more depthful workflow strategy, as we just discussed and mentioned last week. The next is, of all these things that you're doing, the self-evaluation, the new definitions, the new dashboards, the new strategies, is the idea of accuracy of measurement. Nothing should be done unless it's measurable, because measuring it means that there's a capabilities of assessing its success or failure. Doing something for doing it alone and the hopes that it just impacts what you hope and that you throw it in as if the number changes, it must have been it. The Sherlock Holmes mentality. If you remove all points of things of information, no matter how ridiculous whatever is left over must be the truth. That's not the case in this circumstance. Just because you did one promotional campaign didn't do any tracking with it to know whether or not it was successful on its own with its own measurement. But because your revenue went up that month, you threw the tea leaves down and the hawk flew over and grabbed the pigeon or something, and you figured it had to have been this one campaign. That's the only thing that was different. Okay, that's not good accuracy of measurements. That's implied metrics. And gosh knows everybody in the world that doesn't know what they're doing does implied metrics all the time. So, at this point, the second stage, which is measurement and measurement updates, you start asking the question that always has to be asked, and that is, who is responsible for this monitoring? Who is the one that raises their hand and says, "Hey, this isn't right. We have a problem. We have an issue. We have something." What happens usually in the world of business that we have for the average places, until it becomes a problem, it doesn't get anybody's attention. Where if anybody had looked back on the reporting and on the metrics and on the things we're talking about, we would have seen something that would have said, guys, I think this is not producing. I think it's there. It's certainly spending, but it's not producing. I think we have it hasn't hit its threshold. These parameters, these borders, these bumpers that we put our programs through have a high and a low. Either they cost us too much or they don't make us enough money. Those are the kind of the high and lows that most people are familiar with. So how we come close to either of those should come up earlier than, why is there smoke coming out of the back of the building? I wonder if there's a fire. That kind of reactionary, and that usually happens to everyone's detriment, that an owner or a corporate entity or somebody higher in the food chain sees it because that's their world. And then it goes rolling right downhill, down to the person that probably should have seen it soon enough to make the correction so that whoever was high enough didn't. But it's usually the reverse. These kind of accuracies of reports and measurements and strategies really need to have a definition of whose watch is it on? Who's watching for these things? Maybe that could be down to a department. Marketing has to worry about their marketing numbers, or revenue has to worry about the revenue numbers. But to diffuse that siloing that we have been so good at the momentum of having done since post-COVID, is it should be a collective interest. It should be a collective shared KPI. As we've talked about many times before, one of the first commonalities between divisions and departments of revenue and marketing and sales is similar KPIs. What's our goals? Not ROAS. ROAS is marketing. That doesn't help sales. Okay. Revenue generation, top line revenue. Well, that helps revenue and it does help marketing, but it doesn't necessarily contribute to sales, because sales has margins of displacement analysis and value proposition and displacement of its revenue source compared to the other revenue sources that are better yields. So it has to measure more on contribution percentages as it relates to revenue generation. Having that common KPI conversation between everybody means that everybody has a responsibility to the monitoring process of all this data. The ultimate person responsible is the source of the data. If it's marketing data, marketing should be the first canary in the coal mine. If it's revenue data, revenue should be the canary in the coal mine. If it's displacement or value proposition or demand to market outside of transient demand, it's a sales canary in the coal mine. That conversation of responsibility monitoring has to come at the early stages of the dissemination of your campaign analysis in your measurement program. So we've gone through step one, identification. We've gone through step two, measurement updates. Now we go into another fun part. And this sounds very similar to a SWOT analysis. And we've often said SWOT analysis are key elements of this, but this is a different approach to deconstructing and reassembling marketing plans. So the next one is going to be Compset insights. We need to know who we go against to every day, 24/7. Who are we competing with? And guys, it's not always the building across the street from you or in the same town as you. A lot of times it can be a market that is similar to you, a market that is in competition to the type of business that you're getting, because you can say, well, that town 150 miles away is my competitor because we kind of have the same stuff. That might be true for your drive market, maybe even some of your fly market. But you might have a competitor halfway around the world, or at least in another state, or maybe in another country that's close by, that has the same demographics that you get for the same time of year that they're looking to do something that you're competing with that has nothing to do with your in market competition. So, understanding your comp set online as well as in market is critical to your definition of, is your marketing plan addressing them? Are you at pace with what your comp set does? Do you monitor all their specials to know that you have a mark for mark on them, a ghost on the wall, so to speak, that you match every sentinel on the other side, that if they have a special about something, you have a special about something? How are you doing that? How are you monitoring those comp sets to know when they change and what they change and whether they change the rate? Yes, you can use OTA insights. You can see their rate. You can see what they have booked. You can see what their strategy is for the rates. Everybody does that. It's like blink. It's a constant daily game of chicken. I blink before you blink. No, you blink before I blink. That's not strategy. That's reactionary, knee jerk, and unfortunately heavily into the revenue management world of they base themselves against how they see themselves against certain competitors. Smart strategy if you know your tier and know your place in market. Bad strategy if it's just whether or not you're rate ghosting somebody, because then you can get caught where the music stops and you don't have a chair. So I'm using a lot of metaphors today. Sorry, everyone, but I'm in the metaphor world today. So comp insights is critical. What they do is critical. How you're competing with them and matching them is critical. Absorbing your strong suit in comparison to their weak suit and realizing that you have a weak suit to their strong suit, and how well do you make sure that that is minimized in your market plan strategy. And I'm not saying it from an esoteric perspective. I mean, this campaign compared to that campaign of theirs, this channel usage versus their channel usage, our content versus their content, that granular, that detailed, whether you look at it from annual, monthly, or not, that kind of exact match looking conversation, comp set analysis is what market plans have to address. So we're on to the next point of this, which is redefining goals. What I mean by redefining goals is after you've done identification of your KPIs, looked at your granularity, looked at what needs to possibly be modified or if they're good, once you've gone through your measurement updates and created new definitions that you can use, new strategies towards how you're approaching your markets, the accuracy of your measurements, the responsibility of who's monitoring it, you're looking at your comp set in the same lens, you're now redefining your goals. Is every channel, according to what we're spending on them, based on these new goals and measurements and KPIs, are they in the same mix percentage of our budget spend? Does this channel now warrant more money than the other channel? Does this channel exist for the same purpose as that we had previously before? Is there something different we can do with this channel? Is there an undiscovered value of this channel that we never amplified or should amplify based on what we just went through in measurements and identification and comp and everything that we can possibly change? This channel definition, channel goal set creation is your first process in redefining your goals. Then you're looking at redefining your market definitions, your placement in market, not just your tier and your rate and how you're compared to everybody else that's offering inventory into your market that you're comparing yourself to, but also how you as a content generator, as a presence in your market, as a entity of your community, are you presenting your content in a way that matches your marketing goals and matches your communication? It's very critical that you look at those goals and say, do they still sync up with what we know is this business this year and what we think business will be like next year? Because remember, it's a hope and a wing and a prayer that we're looking at next year. We're looking at what we think we know about next year. And if you look now, if you just want to think about this, if you've been in your role this same time last year, is this year working out the way you thought it was last year? I would most likely say there are some people who say, yeah, I feel pretty comfortable, but there's a few people. There's a whole mess of people that are probably going, well, kind of close. I mean, missed it by that much, And then there's other people, and they usually are not telling the truth. They're like, oh yeah, this is exactly what I thought. I don't know of anybody that thought it. Just even ask all the pontificates and the gurus that started the year with a certain trajectory of growth. And then 3 months into, after the first quarter rolls around, they make an adjustment. After the second quarter, they make another adjustment. Why? Because they're guessing. Smart guesses, good, tangible, mathematically calculated, statistically relevant confidence factor guesses, but it's still a crystal ball or a dartboard. And it's based on some good data and so forth. but it's not exactly what they expected. This summer wasn't exactly what I was touting. If you go back to my live shows from January, I was talking about what's the world going to be like now that we don't have revenge travel. Well, guess what? There's a whole other replacement to revenge travel that happened for the summer. And we had a great summer in a lot of places that have summer cycle to them, but it wasn't what I expected. So market definitions are critical when it comes to this as well. Out of this entire process, you are not going to get it right the first time. You're not even going to get it right the second time. You're not even going to get it right the third or the fourth or the fifth time. Multivariate testing is a critical component to redefining your goals. It's nice that you want to change what you're doing. It's nice that you want to explore variations to what you have been doing for advertising. It's nice that you've thought of new ways to actually do things, but you have to test it. You have to test it not just in the broad strokes of campaigns, but you have to test it in channel usage, the definitions of what you're putting into those channels, down to the very ads and ad types that you're putting out there. You need multivariant testing on every tier of what you're doing so that everything can be evaluated in the smallest component of variant possible. Was it this, or this? Was it these two or these three or these five? You can do A/B testing all day long, but that means it's black or it's white. And it's a very elongated process, and nothing is as clear as this or. It's sometimes this and, or these and, or this only, but it's not really an or situation that comes up with variant testing. So when I say multivariant testing, it's because it needs to be on a scale of multivariance. You need to look at several things, not too many that you can't with clarity see that there's some the modifying conditions, but enough that you can see the difference between what you did versus what you didn't do. That multivariant type of testing. And I said down to the ad types, channel types, new channel distribution types, definitions of your markets, campaign types. It's at every tier of your discussion that you need to do multivariant testing. So you've done all these things: identification, measurement, Compset, insights, redefining goals. Now you need to do defined trajectories. This is great. We've identified how we're measuring it. We've clarified how we're going to report it. We're clarified who's going to be responsible for monitoring the reporting. We're identifying our new strategies. We've clarified our relationship with our competitors. We've redefined our goal sets and did multivariant testing with all the things that we've come with this. We've created clarity of what we're going to be doing, we're going to be budgeting for, and our roadmap of what we're doing it. You've got your timetable because you know it has to be next year. But what are your trajectories to this? And what I mean by trajectories to this is once you have this marching order, this thought process of how we're going to get to where we want to go for revenue or whatever goals you define it as. Usually revenue is one of the key elements to all of it, right? And you've defined your new measurements of KPIs, and you're all got everybody's singing the same chorus. We all see the same vision. We all see the same numbers. Every month we have a good idea of what we think the market plan should produce on the channels that we have discussed between revenue, marketing, and sales and operations. Okay. You need to understand the pace and canter to it. There are months that you know that you're going to make a heavy effort with moderate success. There's other months you're going to make a moderate effort with heavy success. That's usually your demand months. Then you're going to have, I can't sell silver dollars for 50 cents on the corner months, no matter how good I'm at everything I've identified. And that usually goes to your demand cycles. Everyone has those months or month that they just, it's not their time. That's not their business. And knowing those things, and that's the real fertile ground for multivariate testing, by the way, looking at cracking the nut. I'll give a great example of this that goes back many, many, many years. I was working with a company. I was up in Canada, and I was presenting to their whole organization to it of digital. We called e-commerce at the time. That's how far back it goes. And everyone was fascinated, and I thought it was a great presentation. It was my presentation. I thought it was great. You know, probably everyone was like, "When's the guy going to be quiet?" Anyways, at the end, this really burly looking dude comes up to me afterwards. He says, "Loren, that was great. You know, that's awesome, but I can't use any of it." I'm like, "Okay, thank you for the candor. Why?" And he was located way up on Yellowknife. And he says, you know, half the year when people can get to us, you know, it's all shale rock or oilers or whatever like that. He says, I literally have people pitching tents behind the hotel because I don't have room at the hotel. And I don't have enough rooms. The other half of the year, and he says, I know my market. I know who they are. They come back. I don't need any help. I don't need any business. I have too much business. What I need is extra rooms. The other half of the year, winter time, and it's hard to get up or what have you. Uh, he says, I could shoot a cannon down the hallway and not hit anybody. There's just nobody. Doesn't want to get here. I said, wow. Okay. Well, listen, you have a clean market. You're good for the year. Half of the year that you're good, and the other half of the year you sit there waiting for the other half to come back. He says, yeah. He says, hey, I said, well, thanks anyway. He says, well, if you ever want to make it up, it's a beautiful place, beautiful country. He says, you can pick a 25-pound trout out or 16-point buck or something you like hunting. I'm like, hey, just curiosity, can you do that fishing and that hunting you just talked about during the 6 months that nobody's there? And he says, well, yeah, for about 3 of it, because, the weather's not turned totally bad by that point. I said, I'll be darned. So it's interesting, but, Japanese businessmen at the time loved to travel to destinations that were so remote that they needed to take planes, trains, automobiles, back road county vehicles, and seaplanes and whatever have you, 8 hours to get to this place. They didn't care. It was the fact that it was off the grid made it even more beneficial to go fishing and go hunting. And so now his hotel only has 3 months out of the year, or did have only 3 months out of the year, that he didn't have as much business as he would like to have. So the moral of the story, boys and girls, is that defining new trajectories and defining new measurements is an ongoing process. Settling for what you think you have based on the efforts of making it is not your only solution. Always thinking about opportunities. Downtimes just mean more creative times. Yes, it doesn't always mean success, but any little success you have is more than the success you had before not trying. And I always find that to be the case. I always smile when hoteliers that are first approaching with, I have this problem, these months are terrible for me and so forth. I smile because that is the biggest impact places you can make. If you can move the needle on those hard months or hard weeks or whatever, then the other ones are easier, because the other ones are just yielding the demand you already have. Actually finding demand or defining demand is the art. That's the fun part. So defining new trajectories is a killer end part of marketing plans. Of course, road mapping a timeline for those and knowing where your roadmap measurements come to. When do I think that we've hit a proper number? How much does that really translate to what number that everybody can be responsible for? If you're talking about ROAS, revenue management and sales teams are sitting back going, God, tell us when you're done bragging, because they have nothing to do with it. The idea of KPIs is I need to make $250,000 this month, more than what we have on the books. Everybody rallies to that, and whatever needle gets moved by that is because collectively everybody knew that the more money we could put to top line revenue towards that $250,000 goal is truly the success rate that we're going to be measured on. That's the attaboy we get. Not whether I pulled a great ROAS out but contributed only nickels, okay, or a group business that we had to give our soul away just for the displacement of occupancy. Those things don't measure to the KPI. So having clear KPIs and having a roadmap of the timeline that those measurements are put upon is critical to the bringing it together part of the entire program of constructing and reassembling a marketing plan. And of course, key element to all of this, one of the key elements to all this, is adaptability of everything we just talked about. The identification process, the measurement process, the comp insight process, the redefining of goal process, the defining of new trajectories process, having to be flexible and knowing that you don't get it right the first time. You don't get it right the second and third, as I just mentioned. It's the fact that it's an ongoing reinterpretation of metrics and modalities. And as long as it's getting you towards the point, like the old stock market chart, it goes up and it goes down. But if you step back and see it over a period of time, it always goes up. That mentality is how you have to approach some of these things. You're going to have setbacks. You're going to have miscalculations. You're going to have missteps, whatever verbiage you want to put to it. The idea is that you do it quickly, get your foot out of the mud, and change trajectory as best you can and adapt to how you did the things you did, and make sure that nothing is so written in stone that you can't erase it. That's critical. Except for, and I will say this with a caveat, your KPI. Those things have to be measured and held to the level of a milestone. And the last and most important of this whole process is ownership. This isn't a handoff. This isn't a somebody else. This isn't a that not my department. This is not just a small cog. It is ownership, the participation of the process of the deconstruction and reassembling of a marketing plan is in the ownership of everybody's participation. Nobody's sitting at the table as an observer. They're not necessary, they're not needed. And if any ownership or any GM or any corporate person wants to disagree with me, I'll bring you on the show. You tell me why it's important for you to sit on the end of a table with your arms crossed, nodding and acting like you know what's going on when you have no input to anything that's being done to get to the achievement level. But it seems that you would be remarkably close to it once it's successful, to share in the glory. That's the part that always gets me critical of people that do that kind of stuff. If you're not there to help, don't be there. If you're not part of the process, you're just part of the problem. I have hard lines like that. If you're my client, you already know I talk like this. If you're not my clients, and this is how I talk, it's critical components to this whole deconstruction reassembling. Now, I did say the topic was deconstructing and reassembling a failing marketing plan. It's what usually gets people's attention. This is for any marketing plan. This is for any modality of approaching how you do marketing. It's not just whether you have a broken car and you're trying to figure out how to make it run. It's even if you have a car that runs well, is it running at best that it can? And do you need a new car? Can you add more features to this car? It's a constant evolving process of a marketing plan. And this is the way you can tackle and approach your marketing plan initiatives, is through this process. So quick recap again: identification, measurement, Compset, redefinition of goals, defining new trajectories, adaptability of everything, and pure ownership of the participants. That is the process of how to deconstruct and reassemble a failing marketing or any marketing plan. So thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to me grind on this. If you disagree, have a comment, any insight, introspection, whatever, you can reach me directly via email, obviously, at Loren@hospitalitydigitalmarketing.com. I answer each and every email, both for the live show and for the podcast that we do right after this. Also, I have a place that if you want to be vocal about it and tell me what permissions I can use your vocality, there's a place called hdm.news/talkback. You can give me your opinion, insight, add a boy, or what were you thinking? Were you, whatever it is, you can leave the audio and then tell me whether or not I can quote you, refer to it, or actually play it on the show. And we've done all three. It's been a lot of fun, people putting their comments in. I've got a lot of them last week. Thank you for that again, about the custom audiences, which really are technically custom segments now. They changed the name on it. Google has anyway. So a lot of feedback from it. Had a nerve with that. We're going to, like I say, dive into that a little bit more with a little bit of help from people that are way smarter than me on the show. We'll bring them in to talk about that. Obviously, we have the podcast outside of the live TV show that you see on your TV channel, TVs, and for the simulcast that we do, we have a hospitality marketing podcast, which is an audio podcast, shorter than this. It's a 20 to 30 minute max audio podcast. We grind into specific tools that we have a technique discussion over. That is always in symbiotic relationship to our content today. So a lot of our podcast discussion today will be about tools used in developing and defining market plan usages, ability to identify KPIs, KPI developments, RPAs as to creating automations. We'll talk about a few tools that are related to basically putting into effect the things I was ranting and raving about just these past 45 minutes or so. So once again, thank you for the privilege of your time. My name is Loren Gray, and I look forward to talking to you all next week.